You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. Deuteronomy 6:8 from the ESV. Welcome to another presentation of Hands and Eyes. I'm Mark Horn, your guide for today, as usual. Alright, repairing the Romans road. We're still in the first of what I hope will be a series, but we're in part 2. Romans 3:21 through 26, and God's righteousness. Alright, let's look at Romans 3:21 through 26 in a larger context than I did in our first video. We're talking here about God's righteousness, or His righteousness, where the pronoun, of course, refers to God in Romans 1-3. Remember, we're trying to make sure we keep this to the exact terms, which is dikaiosune theo, or dikaiosune auto. Alright, we have that coming up in basically 3 places. Once in Romans 1:17, once in Romans 3:5, and then, of course, 4 times, either His righteousness or God's righteousness, Romans 3:21, 22, 25, and 26. Which is why we did our last video, the first video in this, well, I think will be a 3-parter on 3:21 through 26. Alright, so we dealt with, for now, that the Romans 3:21 to 26 was dealt with for now in part 1. But let's look at 3:5, especially in context. Then maybe we'll look at Romans 1:17 in another video. Romans 3:3 through 6 in the ESV. What if some were unfaithful? Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Let God be true, though everyone were a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. But if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? I speak in a human way. By no means, for then how could God judge the world? So that is the passage. And notice that the righteousness of God is basically, in this case, is pretty much a synonym, or means the same as the faithfulness of God. He goes from talking about how their faithlessness nullifies the faithfulness of God. He asks if it does, and he says no. But then he says our unrighteousness does show the righteousness of God. Now, in both cases, we could write these phrases differently in English. We could say, we could ask, does their faithlessness nullify God's faithfulness? And we could say, we could ask if our unrighteousness serves to show God's righteousness, what shall we say? All right, it's the same thing. The issue, God's faithfulness, God's righteousness, is the issue. The issue is the vindication of God's character. I don't think that's very hard to understand or hard to see in this text. So note the similarities. Romans 3:5 show God's righteousness. Romans 3:21, as we showed in part 1, God's righteousness has been manifested. Romans 3:25 show His righteousness. Romans 3:26 show His righteousness. And I think the ESV on 3:25 would say show God's righteousness. But anyway, it's all the same thing. So notice the relations then. Our unrighteousness shows God's righteousness. 3:3 through 6. Setting forth Christ the propitiation in blood shows God's righteousness. That's what 3:21 through 26 is all about, as we saw in the first of our videos. So the implication then is pretty obvious. Our unrighteousness was putting Jesus to death on the cross, which showed God's righteousness and bringing the promised salvation. And in fact, 3:1 through 6, or 3:1 through 8, that whole context is about specifically Israel's unrighteousness, how their unfaithfulness showed forth the faithfulness of God. So that the implications there is that passage is not about, if God forgives our sin and proves Himself righteous, does that mean our sin is somehow a good thing because it shows that God's righteous, blah, blah, blah. That's not what's going on. Excuse the informality of the blah, blah, blah there. I just get carried away. But the point here is it's talking about in history that the climax of unrighteousness, the crucifixion of Jesus, was in fact the perfect demonstration of God's righteousness, because it brought about the salvation of the world which He had promised, and thus He demonstrated that He was righteous in keeping His promises and being both just and the justifier of those who have faith in His Son. All right. So my conclusions are then pretty simple. There is no need to change Paul's wording or message to get a righteousness from God in Romans chapter 3. That was the whole point. The implication that they seem to be trying to give us by changing the wording from righteousness of God to God's righteousness at certain points is to imply that there's a different term involved, and this means a righteousness from God. The way, as we saw, the NIV goes ahead and, I guess, boldly paraphrases, or perhaps too boldly deceives. Other passages like Philippians 3:9 can be used for that purpose because that's where Paul actually said it. Again, that's in the first video, so I'm hoping you've watched that already. Romans 3 is a fantastic and clear passage about how God redeemed us. It doesn't need these kinds of insertions, additions, or perhaps twistings to help us understand Paul's meaning. So to be continued, next video in part 3 we'll look at Romans 1:17 in context and round this all out. Please, I'd love for your feedback. You can go to the website handseyes.org and go to the contact tab. Or you can go to the donate tab if you want to help me out so I can put these videos out more often and perhaps with better technology. Thank you very much. Hope you guys have a great time until we meet again here on YouTube.